practice in the Department of Pediatrics and Merit. And the Merit program is an education services program in the Faculty of Health Sciences dedicated to supporting FHS schools, departments, and programs in advancing health professionals education scholarship. And with a vision to really grow a community of scientists and clinicians to advance health professionals education through research and applied science. Today's education round is hybrid, so welcome to those who are joining over Zoom and everyone here in person. And many of us in this event are connected by the land on which we work. So I wanted to take this time to recognize that McMaster is on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon belt. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. Now, before leaving the stage to our esteemed guest here, I will provide a very brief introduction. So the title of today's education round is Vertical versus Horizontal Assessment Methods for Scoring Physiotherapy Entrance Interviews. Now, we have two speakers, Dr. Sarah Wojkowski and Professor Greg Spadoni. Now, Dr. Wojkowski is the Assistant Dean of Physiotherapy in the School of Rehabilitation Sciences and Director of the Program for Interprofessional Practice, Education and Research, which we know by short as PIPER. And Professor Spadoni is an Associate Professor in the School of Rehabilitation Sciences in Physiotherapy and current Chair of the Physiotherapy Program's Admissions Committee. Now, during the rounds, for those joining over Zoom, feel free to use the chat for comments and questions. We will have a Q&A period at the end, and you can also ask your questions by using the hand raising function. And for those joining in person, please just simply wait for the Q&A period, unless the speakers want you to ask questions in between. So without further ado, please go ahead. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Sarah and I are really excited to be here. So welcome everybody who's here with us in person, and also welcome to the folks who we're seeing virtually. We're going to present some research that we did to help to improve the process of our admissions cycle in the context of physiotherapy. Folks always believe that medicine is a tough program to get into, but I'm going to suggest to you that physiotherapy is equally as tough in terms of the competitiveness of it. There's 15 schools in Canada that educate physiotherapists at a master's level entry program. And by way of example, this year in our admissions program, we had 1,376 applications to our school, and we'll assign between 65 and 70 places. So very important to make sure that we're doing a good job of this. Okay, here we go. I think I got it now. Okay, so here's an outline of what we hope to achieve today. In a moment, we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll give you an overview of the physiotherapy admissions process in the context of what are some of those program requirements, and what have been some of the changes that we have instituted in the McMaster Physiotherapy program. We'll give you a better understanding of vertical reviews of candidates versus horizontal reviews of candidates. Discuss the methods related to our study, with our study followed by our results, and speak about some discussion points, and then hopefully engage the audience in some dialogue beyond that. So of course, this is our team that co-authored the paper with us. Dr. Jenna Smith-Tertian, who's in the middle, she was the primary on the paper, and Sarah and I and Luciana and Paul Stratford were associated with authoring the paper. Luciana and Paul in particular are our statistical experts, So Sarah and I have already decided that if there's any really tough statistical questions, this is for Jeff Norman, who I know is in the audience. We're going to just give you Paul's email, and you can email Paul, and he'll address those questions in that way. Okay, I'll begin because I'm speaking now, and then I'll let Sarah pick up. And I followed her lead with how she set this slide up. So I began my journey here at McMaster back in the day, and I was here on three different occasions that led me to this position where I'm going to be speaking from now. I'm a physiotherapist by training, and when I graduated, I went out into clinical practice. And then in 2000, I came back to McMaster and started teaching as a sessional faculty after I completed my master's degree in rehabilitation sciences. And that's where my journey in the context of education began. And then 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to assume a full-time position on the faculty. So I transitioned my career at that point from a clinician educator to an educator with a little bit of a clinical role. And as you'll come to know in a minute, Sarah's a mom with a happy face, so I had to do something as well. So I thought, what could I do that would be somewhat cheeky and similar? So I said, well, I'm a father and a father-in-law. My son got married this summer, so that's a picture of myself and my clan and my new daughter-in-law.
I can use this keyboard here. I usually wander, so that's why Greg was going to give me the.
I'll stay over here.
Yeah, that's okay. So welcome everyone. It's great to see you. As already has been suggested, I'm Sarah Wojkowski, and I have a little bit of a different trajectory than Greg to come to speak with you today. But I have done all my training at McMaster. So people say I bleed maroon, and that's probably true. But I'm very, very fortunate to have had a number of experiences along the way, both clinically and with some other educational institutions to kind of help shape the lens that we see this data through. And I think that's important because sometimes as parents, as faculty members, as teachers, when we're thinking about admissions, right, we're thinking about really important decisions in terms of the trajectory of someone's life and where they may end up in their academic career. And so for us, we really take the decisions related to admissions quite seriously, and felt that as we were transitioning from in-person to use of technology, that we had to strike a really good chord with how we do this process. So I am a mom, as Greg has suggested, but I also have done some postgraduate training with the OTC, which is the Ontario Training Center, and it's really looking at policy decisions in healthcare. So I sometimes try to look at some of our research through that lens of policy analysis and how can we inform what we're doing a little bit better. I'm a teaching track faculty. I have permanence, but that does mean that my life kind of sits in educational scholarship, which is why Merit is such a wonderful place to have the chance to come and share some of our work that we've done today. And I think that's a little bit about who we are. So now that you have that context, I think it'll help shape some of the next few slides that we're going to talk about. Okay. And Greg's going to tell me, because sometimes I get so excited and then I just keep going and we have slides that we said we talked to. So if I override one of those slides, Greg's going to give me the hook and tell me to move on. Okay, what I think is really important is to set up the position of the physiotherapy program, just to understand why we made some of the admissions changes that we look to evaluate. And we really see kind of physiotherapy at MAC in terms of two chunks, pre-2018 and 2018 and onwards. And that's because in prior to 2018, there were a lot of changes. We went from originally a diploma program shared between Mohawk and McMaster, then to a Bachelor of Health Sciences, which was a secondary bachelor's degree. So learners had to have some sort of undergraduate 3-year degree before they came in. And then it moved to a master's program in 2004. And that move was across the country to change the entry-level requirements for physiotherapy programs. During the transition between the undergraduate and the first level masters, there were some tweaks to the curriculum, but there wasn't a major overhaul. So by the time 2018 was rolling around, you can appreciate the curriculum was almost 20 years old. Sure, there had been some small revisions to keep up with evidence-based practice, but the curriculum as a whole hadn't been renewed. So we decided that we were going to take on a major undertaking for a curriculum renewal. And we had a target date of implementing that curriculum renewal in 2018, so that the first graduating cohort was 2020. As part of that process, we wanted to change how we went about admitting applicants into the program. Like Greg has suggested, physiotherapy has historically had a very high number of applicants for a very small number of spots. Similar to some of the other health professional programs, they apply to physiotherapy through an external organization. So in rehab's perspective, it's called ORPAS, or the Ontario Rehab Program Sciences Application Service. It's like as long as the title that we have with our last name sometimes. And those services, that service basically collates and then pushes the information to the school. And the school then needs to make a decision around who of those applicants that we're interested in taking. So if we think about pre-curriculum renewal, what actually happened in MMI language might be familiar to some of you in the room. We used in-person mini interviews. So people would have to come to campus, they'd rotate through 8 to 12 stations. We'd have a faculty or a clinician, and they would do a series of interviews, all using the old pen and paper score. They'd collate them, and that's how we would come up with a final ranking. Just because of the limitations of needing to be on site, the number of bodies we needed, we only could offer interviews to 300 people using the old MMI system. So 300 people out of 1,300 applications really funneled down pretty quickly in terms of who it was that we could bring in. So the way that that was arranged was they just solely ranked on GPAs. So the top 300 GPAs would get an in-person interview, and then from there, their ranking could be reorganized based on their interview performance. But we knew that with accessibility challenges, with wanting to draw from a large or a wide range of applicants from across Canada and internationally, that coming on campus posed a bit of a challenge. And what was happening is schools were fighting for what weekend we would do the interviews. So sometimes people would have to choose, maybe I want to go to the U of T interview, or maybe I want to go to the MAC interview, but it didn't give us a lot of opportunity to be creative. So what we decided was we looked at what some of the systems were that were out there. We moved to a Kira talent system, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And that allows us now to offer any given year between 750 to 900 interviews. We could offer more, but what's happening between the 1,300 and the 750 and 900 is that people are applying that don't have the minimum requirements. So they're throwing their name in the hat without the minimum sub GPA, or then putting their name in the hat without having the appropriate level of a 4-year prerequisite undergraduate, or without some of the prerequisite courses. So we have capacity to interview more. It's just the applicants themselves aren't meeting the requirements. So that's what's happening to move us from that 1,300 down to 750 to 900, depending on any given year. And so now we actually offer these asynchronous videos. It's a video response. It happens over 2 weeks. So applicants can do it at a time that works for them, and then they go into review by our review team. So just to kind of orientate Kira, because most of what we're going to talk about later on depends on the Kira structure. Kira is a system that we have a contract with, and they work with us to develop the competencies and or the questions that we're going to pose to our candidates. We have a pool of questions for each competency that we identified as being core to our interview process. And every year, those competencies are reevaluated and the questions are redone. So we're growing our pool over time. So there's no 2 people that will have the exact same interview process. Each of you might have a question from the themes, but the question prompt that you would receive could look very different. Kira is great because it allows us to meet all the accessibility requirements, closed captioning, we can extend time, we can look at text resizing, so each applicant's individual needs can be met based on their requirements. And what we've decided is they respond to 8 questions over the course of their asynchronous response. One is written in time, and then the other is a video stem or prompt that's asked by a faculty member, and then they have 2 minutes to record themselves, camera on, answering the question. So that's really important to understand that context of Kira, because it will inform a little bit about our next step. To kind of pause and put our stuff on hold in terms of what the PT side of things still does, we just wanted to make sure that we were using some common language in terms of rater bias, because now we'll get into the analysis side of things. So we know that when we're looking at biases, it's just a tendency that one might have in terms of rating another's performance. But there's different types of biases. Some is stringency, some there's item-specific bias, and some there's carryover bias. I won't read all the words on the screen. Clearly, everybody here is able to read, but I'll just say that we're going to focus, or we chose to focus our research on carryover bias. And that's when an impression that a rater might have influences a response or a rating to a subsequent question. So if I see an applicant early on and I hear their answer to one question, 2 or 3 questions later, I might have that answer still in my mind and think, I'm going to rate that response based on the what I've already heard. So we term that the halo effect, or we didn't term it, but it's commonly known as the halo effect. And we know that it's a challenge when there's an assessor that looks at multiple items for the same applicant. So if I was asked to rate all 8 questions, this might be a larger concern than if I was only asked to rate 1 question. Okay, and then this was just some research that has already existed. Again, it just was us going to the literature to say, is there going to be any interest in terms of writing a paper, doing some additional research, and helping us understand how biases, I'm sorry, I can't, if I go over here, you can't see me. Sorry, I'm a wanderer, so I'm not very good for those of you that were online, my apologies. And so these were just some common themes that came out in the literature around the types of biases that may show up at any stage of the application process, and things that we wanted to really think about how we may or may not be able to address with our new system. Unfortunately, I would say that we don't have the perfect answer to all of those, but we're trying. And what we're hoping to do at the end of the conversation today is maybe open up some discussion to know from you what you're doing in your programs to help address some of these other common biases that people are seeing today. And if I go again, I'm sure I'm going to get the hook. Okay.
No, this is still you. I'm
okay, good. Yeah. Okay. So then the horizontal and vertical assessment. This is where, again, we went to the literature to see who else was starting to look at this component. And we have a slide. The next slide is going to explain what horizontal versus vertical means. But basically what we found was that there was no research that had currently been done that looked at physiotherapy specifically. So we felt, okay, this is a gap in the literature that we can likely address based on some of the work that we're doing. But of the 4 studies that we did identify, mostly in medicine, mostly international data, not Canadian specific, we found that inter-rater reliability increased, the internal consistency decreased, and there was a decrease in that carryover bias or that halo effect, which is what we were targeting when we were starting to think about our own research. So it gave us good hope that we potentially had an opportunity to contribute to the literature and look at our data a little differently. Okay, I will pass it to you now, Greg.
Thank you.
Yes.
Of course, having an unbiased assessment process or reducing the bias is very important to our program as it is to all programs. So this is why we're putting so much effort into ensuring that the methods that our evaluators are using to assess the candidates introduce the least amount of bias associated with it. So when we set out then, based on the review of some previous literature that Sarah just outlined, we had a couple of goals in mind in the context of how we might formulate our study. So we wanted to, as you've heard, we wanted to provide some insight whether or not there's a difference in this carryover bias or this halo effect that happens with these 2 different forms of interviewing, the vertical versus the horizontal. And then we also wanted to look at the reliability of raters' scores, inter-rater reliability and also intra-rater reliability. So these were 3 questions that we boiled it down to. 1, we wanted to determine if there was evidence of carryover bias in the vertical scoring methods. 2, we wanted to estimate the inter-rater reliability of using both the vertical and the horizontal methods of scoring. And 3, determine assessor satisfaction with the horizontal method of assessment. These pieces are very important to our candidates, but this piece is also very important, the 3rd piece, and important to us from a program basis, because you can imagine that when we move from approximately 300 interviews in the MMI phase to potentially 900 interviews in the Kira phase, there could theoretically be an increased burden on our assessor pool. So we want to make sure that these folks are happy with how things are moving along as well in the context of their experiences. So I'm going to talk this through first, and then I'm going to show you a pictorial representation of what I just said. So if it's not making sense in the moment, hopefully when you see the pictorial representation, there'll be an epiphany of sorts. So as Sarah suggested, we compared two cohorts interviews, 2020 and 2021. Each cohort had 8 questions or 8 items. We're using that term interchangeably here in the 2 years. One of those questions is a written response, and the other 7 are verbal responses. In the vertical review, 2 assessors reviewed every question, all 8 questions for each candidate. In 2021, in the horizontal review, each assessor evaluated less questions, 2 to 3 questions, and we paired them up such that we had 3 subsets. So each candidate was evaluated by 6 raters, but on fewer questions. So that's how the vertical was assigned horizontal assigned relative to the vertical. Cohorts and both groups of assessors, they received the same training. So our training consists of a printed manual, a virtual webinar where we explain the process, go through the scoring, went through the scoring paradigms, and allowed for some practice videos in the context of that evaluative piece, and then later sent each of the evaluators an individual TIRA candidate that they would then assess and assign a score to. In order to try to decrease or lessen the opportunity for unconscious bias, we started to introduce a module that in 2020 was optional, and in 2021 became mandatory for all of the assessors. And in the mandatory phase in 2020, we required each of the evaluators to write a 200-word reflection on unconscious bias. Just by way of an aside, in 22 and this year, we updated that. And now, in place of the 200-word written reflection, we have 5 MCQ questions related to the unconscious bias training that they have to be successful on in order to proceed as an evaluator. So here's the pictorial representation. So you can see on your left, we've got the vertical. So we've got 2 evaluators, 1 blue, 1 orange, and each of them is evaluating on the 8 questions for the candidates. If we look at the horizontal, which is on your right, we can see now, just by way of the colored dots here, that we've got assessors assessing 2 to 3 candidates. So for instance, blue and orange, they're assessing 3, green's assessing 3, purple, and if this is red, they're assessing 2. So each candidate is now assessed by 6 reviewers, and 2 reviewers are assigned to each of the respective questions. In terms of the presentation of the actual interview questions, they were the same contextually in terms of the order of those competencies that Sarah spoke of to each of the candidates. As we indicated, there's a number of questions within each subset of the specific competencies, so those were randomly allocated to the candidates. The evaluators scored the candidates on a 5-point scale, 5 being the most favorable score. And they also provided an overall impression score. So at the end of their scoring of a particular candidate, they would also provide an overall impression score for that particular candidate. At the end of the 2021 review period, we also surveyed our assessors to identify their satisfaction with this new method of scoring, i.e. vertical versus the horizontal. And obviously that would have only been applicable to those who had done it in the prior year in 2020. So then in general, just the particular methodology and setup that we had for the interviews, there was paired observations that were available for each of the candidates, and that allowed for 2 independent estimates of summary statistics for each of the potential candidate that we had.
Okay, so this is me again.
Yeah.
So because of our interest in bias, we couldn't measure it directly. So we had to come up with a proxy for how we were going to look at carryover bias, because it's something that really is challenging to directly measure. And so what we did, and we're only going to show you a subset today, because as you can imagine, for 8 questions and so many reviewers, we have pretty large matrices. So we've condensed them for the purposes of the presentation. But we did come up with these multi-question matrices that looked at reviewer ratings between each other, amongst each other, and then across the subsets. So it'll be hopefully more clear in just a minute. And then we made a statement that we said in the 2020 cohort that we would believe that carryover bias would exist if we looked at the scores for the same rater. So if the questions that I was rating or responsible for rating was higher than the scores between me and another rater for the same question. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll show you the grids here in a minute. We have the full reference for the publication, and then all the data is available online if you wanted to go and see it. So it is openly available, and you're more than welcome to go and take a look. We also wanted to look for our second objective sorry, I'm getting the wave to come back out into the open there. Yeah. We wanted to look at the inter-rater reliability, or the averages for each of the cohorts. So then we looked at the difference overall for the ICC in the 2020 and in the 2021 cohort. And we wanted to look to see would there be a significant difference between the 2 cohorts in and of itself. And then, of course, we've got some rater satisfaction descriptor statistics. So we'll show you the tables next, and then I think this will hopefully make sense. So we're really fortunate. Like our admissions process could not run without the goodwill of the clinicians in the community, and I think you can see that by the number of people that were involved as our assessors. So we had 144 in 2020 and 165 people in 2021 that volunteered their time to do these admission reviews for us. So they're not paid, they're volunteered reviewers. In these 2 cohorts, we had 741 and 883 interviews respectively that we looked at. In 2021, we were able to retain 61% of our assessors. So they were repeat assessors for us, which was great because they were able to give us some really important feedback from their experience in 2020 and compared to what happened in 2021. Okay, and so we are going to show you now. Hopefully this is not too hard to read, but I'm noticing the colors show up a little bit differently on the big screen than maybe on our smaller screen. So let's just orient ourselves first. The first or the top table is the 2020 data set. The bottom is the 2021 data set. Why you'll know that there's 2 different colors, or it's supposed to be 2 different colors, it maybe doesn't come out as cleanly, is that we had those 2 raters going from top to bottom in 2020. And in 2021, we actually had subsets of raters. So you might remember subset 1, subset 2, subset 3. So in the green, it was a group of raters that were reviewing a certain group of the questions that the applicants were asked. Yellow is a different set of raters, and blue is a different set of raters. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated to look at some of this data, but hopefully that holds. So in this bottom chart, really, we're talking about 6 different raters when we're looking at the analysis, compared to the top when we're looking at 2 different raters. Somebody asked us when we did this presentation before, why we didn't just give you the competencies and like assign a name to the rater. We actually don't want the competencies to be shared out loud because we don't explicitly tell the applicant what the competencies are that we're looking for. We say that as part of our admissions process, we're looking at competencies that align with the physiotherapy profession. But if we give them to you today, I guarantee that they will likely be on the internet, or people will be knocking down the door asking for what those competencies are that they're going to be evaluated. So I appreciate, for the purposes of today's presentation, it seems a bit cryptic, but it's intentional because we don't actually advertise the competencies that the applicants are being rated on, which may open up its own set of discussions. I don't know, we'll see where that takes us. But I think what we wanted to really point out when we were going through this is that you can see here, competency 1, rater 1. So the reliability coefficient was 1, like it was comparing to itself. So that makes sense. Down here, we can see rater 1 looking at question 1, and rater 1 looking at competency or question 4. So this is the relationship that rater 1's had on question 4 compared to its first question that it was looking at. And then this is competency 8. Oh, sorry, this is a touch screen. I'll have to like bring it back.
That's way better. That's way
So you can see here that we go for a 0.44 and a 0.42. I don't know, can I scroll up though? I don't know if this is gonna be. Okay. Okay, very good. See, this is my, maybe not. Okay, here we go. Awesome. Okay, this is like really, this is like working with the big iPad. What we can see down here though, is when we look at the change in the values, we went from like a 0.42 to a 0.25. So the numbers actually significantly decreased when we went from 2020, looking at the relationship between rater 1 and competency 4. And so that's quite interesting, because you have to remember now, this is a different person that we're comparing to at this point in time. And so we wanted to see these numbers decrease. That means that there was less influence of that first rater on the score for the 4th question than there was up top when they were responsible for looking at both of those questions. I don't know if I've done a night. I don't know if I can resize it here so that it's.
Try a double tap.
Oh, a double tap.
No.
Okay, that's pretty close. Pretty close. I know. I'm sorry. The numbers are okay. All right. Sorry.
Good.
We don't have these special boards in the rooms that we teach in, so this is still pen and paper or whiteboard marker for us. But I think generally what we want to suggest here is when you're looking at the tables, the 2020s compared to the 2021s, when you look at the numbers, each of those numbers have been reduced in that second cohort when we introduced more raters and each rater touching less of the questions. And so that was really positive for us. That's exactly what we were hoping to see by doing this analysis. No, I don't know though if I'm going to be able to do this here. Is it any?
There it is.
Okay, very good. But I think I've moved slides here. So then what we've done here, as we looked at the overall interclass correlation coefficient between the 2020 and the 2021 year, we're seeing that there is an increase between 2020 and 2021, which is okay, but that difference was actually statistically significant. And so that is also really something that we were hoping to see, to suggest that the impact or the influence of one rater on the applicant's overall outcome or total ranking for interviews was less. So we were really excited to see that information come forward. Still some work to do, and we can tell you what we've been doing now, but that was a step in the right direction. We also had our assessors, 86 of them answered the survey. I'm going to come over here so I don't touch this one. I think if I touch it, then it's not going to do the fancy things here. So we had 86 assessors, a 52% response rate, actually fill out our survey at the end of the year. And so like I said, we've asked those who did both to compare what their experiences was. And for the most part, they really appreciated having just a subset of questions that they were asked to review. The comments suggested that they were better able to understand what a response might be for those subsets of questions. But they did actually struggle with providing an accurate overall impression score. So because they looked at only a small subset of the applicant's questions, they weren't really confident saying overall how strong did we feel the applicant would be. But you know, in general, they preferred the fact that they had fewer questions to look at, even though it meant that they would look at more applicants overall. And this kind of reiterates what that theme looks like. I think the overall perception was that they even articulated in their own response, they felt that their bias was less. when they were asked to only look at a smaller portion of the applicant's admissions components. And they felt that it was much fairer to the applicant because there were more eyes and more individuals determining if they would be an appropriate applicant for the program. So those were some of our major themes that we found along the way.
So as Sarah has suggested in the results piece just a moment ago, that our analysis of those correlation coefficients, which infer the presence of this carryover bias, were present for the sets, for both data sets, but they did not demonstrate a carryover bias between the raters. So by having more raters, less influence of potential bias on one individual candidates, and then improves the overall psychometric properties associated with that style of evaluation. As you saw, those inter-rater reliability scores, they were moderate in both of the cases there, 0.62, 0.74, but there was a statistically significant decrease. There was a statistically significant difference. It increased to 0.74 in 2021 versus 2020. And what we did was we converted those ICCs to standard error of measurement, which produces a value in the same metric of the scoring device. So this is a score that's out of 40. And if you recall from 2 slides ago, in 2020, the SCM was calculated at 2.86. And in 2012 was calculated at 1.2. So what we did to sort of appreciate the impact of that change in reliability, and when we converted it to a standard error of measurement, is that we looked at the candidates, the highest candidate's average score on the interview, which was 38.5 out of 40. If we apply the standard error of measurement from the 2020 subset, which was 2.86, it would move this candidate from the #1 position to the 45th position. Conversely, if we apply the measurement error from the 2021 subset, which was 2.12, it moved them from the 1st position to the 26th position. So we can see that there's certainly, we indicate there's a statistical difference between the two, but there's also a very apparent difference here when we categorize it this way to see the influence of adopting and changing that reliability in a more favorable place. Presumably, it would continue to decrease if we had more raters assessing more of the questions over that period of time. And assessors who preferred the other piece that we discovered was assessors who preferred the vertical assessment. They had more difficulty with the horizontal, as Sarah suggested, providing an overall impression. And I'm going to talk more about that finding in a moment. A quantitative analysis not discussed here today in this study found high correlation coefficients between the overall impression scores that were provided and the total score, demonstrating that the overall impression score didn't really add any additional information to the candidate's evaluation. And also, we recognize that the overall impression score inherently allows for the opportunity for some bias to be introduced as well. So, with what we've found and what we've discussed up to this point, we've determined that at this juncture, that these findings support the continuation of the horizontal review method of physiotherapy candidates and the removal of the overall impression scoring for future physiotherapy interview iterations.
And I think that's what we've done, just because you're seeing data from 2020 and 2021, just to reassure you that we've learned from our own analyses that going forward, starting in the 22 cycle, we removed the overall impression score that we asked. raters to do. So there's no longer that component that we asked of them. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Okay, that's a good segue because you're going now.
oh, yeah, okay, that's good. Okay. So we recognize there's some inherent limitations, and certainly we recognize that we need to learn from our own works. So as we suggested, one of the things that we've learned straight away is that we remove that overall impression score, and we're hoping at the end of this year to rerun some of our analyses so that we can see what that result looks like. Moving somebody from the 40 down 45 positions versus down 26 positions, just in terms of full transparency, likely would not affect whether or not they would get a first round offer to the program. So even with those standard areas of measurements, we usually offer about double the number that we need in the first round in order to fill, because many of the applicants that we see also apply to medicine, also apply to physiotherapy programs across Canada. So we know we need to almost double the number of first round offers that go out in terms of you know, filling a cohort without too many rounds of waitlists that we go to. But that being said, we still have removed the overall impression score, and we've moved forward with that. We've also tried to change how we're doing unconscious bias training, and Greg has alluded to that. We had quite a bit of feedback from the 200-word essay that was a lot to ask the volunteers to do the training mock videos, to do the 200-word essay, and to watch a module. And so we certainly have modified that over the course of time. What we didn't do, and that's a gap for us, and we really need to think about it, is we didn't look really deeply into the diversity of who our assessors were. We asked the assessors to fill out an optional diversity survey, but our response rates are not high. So that's one of the pieces that we still don't know, how the assessors maybe are influencing who those learners are that are coming into the program. And so that's some work that we certainly need to think about. We also didn't account for the range of the experiences that our assessors had. So similar to kind of what we suggested at the beginning, you know, when we appreciate with admissions, we're making some big decisions for those applicants based on what they've submitted for us. And we've heard from learners that are maybe a bit more junior, just in their entry to practice stages, that it's really hard for them to discern who might be a strong applicant and who might be someone who would struggle through the program. So we do think that it's potential. There's potential that a rater's experience, both in their clinical and in the amount of times that they've maybe gone through the admissions process as a reviewer, might actually influence how they're rating people overall. But we didn't account for that in this analysis. This time, what we really wanted to understand is the number of eyes. That being said, when you think about increasing the number of reviewers that are looking at an applicant, we're hopeful that we kind of mitigate some of those concerns just by virtue of the fact now that there's 6 different people instead of 2 people looking at the applicants themselves. So those are some things that we have appreciated and that we know that we need to do some future work on. We're hoping at the end of this cycle, we actually have moved now to almost 1 rater per 1 question. So we've gone 1 step further, appreciating that the SDM should continue to become smaller, which would change very minimally where they would rank in the overall offer list. And so we're hoping at the end of this admission cycle that we'll be able to run, I'm looking at Greg because he's the admissions chair, some additional analysis to see if we've hit a good spot in terms of what our number of applicants to reviewer ratios would look like. So we have some discussion questions that we brought forward, but we're certainly happy to answer any questions from the group. And these are our graduates they were the first ones that went through some of this change in terms of assessment. And this was their very last OSCE right before they left us and moved on to practice. And so we have them here to say that, you know, ultimately they were very successful in how they came through the program and with here, regardless if they went through the vertical or the horizontal screening, but they were certainly a group that will stay with us for a long time because they were the first ones that we saw come through the program in its revised form. So, thank you so much for listening, and we're certainly happy to take questions from those of you virtual or those of you in the room. And I'll stop moving because I know that.
I got a question. So you found the total score and the overall impression score sort of covariate together. They were highly correlated.
Yes.
Yeah. And if I understand correctly, the total score is a composite of a number of things. questions.
Right.
And then you have your overall impression score.
Yeah.
Well, why disregard the overall impression score instead of the total score? Why make a decision the one way and not the other way? Strike me that the overall impression score was easier to collect.
I think, so it's something that we wrestled with, to be honest. What one would we drop and which one would we keep? I think part of the feedback that we heard was that when reviewers were only looking at one or two questions, they didn't feel confident in their overall impression score, because the overall impression was, do you feel like this applicant would be a good candidate for the program? But if they're only answering or only seeing the responses to one competency, X, they didn't feel like they could make that comment overall would they be good, because they didn't hear about competency B, C, D, E to get there. So, and some of it was influenced by the reviewer's confidence, even in their own scoring, of that overall impression.
Yeah, I don't know what's right. Like,
Yeah,
I don't mean to imply that one way was right or another. But the stats supported that confidence be damned if it worked out okay, right? And I'm just always shocked by how accurate or sort of thin slice or really quick judgments are. It's just a food for thought.
It is a good question, and it may also speak to the point that Sarah mentioned in terms of some of the limitations in the context of the experience of our assessor pool. So what I'm going to just suggest is that probably some of those assessors would be more confident and feel more confident in their ability to assign that overall impression score, and others might struggle to some degree. But I think, and I know what you're suggesting, Lawrence, is that if they both match one another, then why even bother scoring the 8 questions? Let's just listen to them for 20 minutes and then assign them a score. And that might have worked when the evaluator did all 8, but now that they're only doing 2, they and we recognize some of the limitations of that, for sure.
Though, isn't it?
It is fascinating.
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and you're right. Like that could be a whole other research question. If we just used their overall impression score, how would they rank?
Yeah.
It sort of speaks to the great debate, right, Lawrence, of what is the best way to assess candidates, what is the best way to determine, who's going to be most appropriate and most successful in the context of this as well. The other little aside I'll just throw in right at the moment that we didn't mention yet is that what moving to the Kira platform and 750 to 900 applicants also allowed us was a much broader representation of potential candidates, because there weren't any barriers for candidates to come on site and do the interview. And we've seen this in the geographical composition of our classes now in terms of representation from British Columbia, from the East Coast of Canada, from Newfoundland. Having been associated with the program for 23 years now, historically we didn't see that sort of geographical diversity happening. So lots more opportunities that way as well.
Yeah, but it is. We could totally flip it and say, just here's your overall impression score. Where would they have ended up ranking, and would it have made a difference? It's hard to say. Yeah. Someone else can do it. If someone wants to come and do it. We got lots of data. It's not fun. And I think, we do use overall impression scores for other things once they're in the program. So it is interesting, it's a good point. So head scratching.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Sam, are the 2 comments questions?
I don't see them on mine, so it might be directly to the presenter podium. So you can click on, I'm not entirely sure if it, here we go.
Okay.
Yeah, for some reason I'm not getting the question.
Okay, oh, very pretty data. Yes. I don't know, here, okay, but that's okay, sorry.
Yeah, like direct message to
Podium and not to me.
that's probably a comment
More than from Jen,
there. And
okay, out of curiosity, does your process include a rubric? Yeah, they do. So, Anna, without trying to sell too many state secrets here, I think Greg alluded to there's a scale from 1 to 5, and it's the rubric suggests that a 5 is an answer that completely addresses the STEM or the competency question that was asked, and a 1 is applicant did not address the question at all, and then there's some benchmarks in between. for each of the competencies, and this gets a little bit abstract because I can't tell you what those competencies are, we have a descriptor of what it might mean. So let's say we said, I'm trying to say, let's say we said best presenter ever, and they had to have a competency around presentations, right? We'll just use that. So, you know, the presentation fully met the objectives of the assignment. They used examples that well illustrated and well linked their information, and that they would be ranked amongst, or their response would be rated very strongly in terms of really meeting or fulfilling all the criteria. So one, they did a presentation, they basically stood up, they held up a piece of paper with some writing on it, they expected us to follow it. That would kind of be an example of the score. But we do define the competency, and then we do give them a rubric on that scale with different benchmarks to help them evaluate the candidate. I don't know if that answered your question.
We're hoping we got at least a 4 today.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know what the competency is.
Well, just give us your overall impression
There
rating.
you go, there you go. Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad that answers it. Sorry to be a bit abstract, but maybe at one point we'll answer what the competencies are.
Like presumably, there's a publicly available competency framework for
There is.
physiotherapy
There is.
education, and
Yes.
presumably your MMI stations map to it.
Presumably. If not completely, then at least partially.
Partially.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
applicants don't know this?
Well, applicants are encouraged to look at whatever documents they think
Okay.
might assist them in an application. But what we don't want them to do is come in, and that's why we, even in the publication, you'll see that we don't actually disclose what the competencies are, because we don't want them to come in with like a rote or a memorized question, like, oh, I have to speak about X. And so anytime because I'm not gonna know which question is prompting me on this competency, but I'm gonna drop those key words in along the way. So that's why we've made that conscious decision. Like we encourage people to say, what is it about physio that you know? But really, truly, it doesn't matter to us. Like when we look at the background of the applicants, we have some people who are engineers who have come over to physio. We have some people that were outdoor education specialists who have come in. So we want them draw on their own experiences and make links to the prompting questions, which is why we made the conscious decisions to say we're not evaluating you on A, B, C, D, E, because we don't want those keywords to necessarily be what they're stemming their answers from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get it. You don't want people to prep for the test, really, kind of, but you want them to give
Yeah, very genuine.
authentic answers that
Authentic
have
answers.
that sort of applied value.
That's right.
It just strikes me that your comments probably aren't that hidden, right? Like
No,
your,
the profession's competencies are out there.
yeah, like
Yeah.
your aspirant who's really into it probably has figured out what your competencies are already, right?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, if they really wanted to, they would go into it. Yeah, it's, are we marking them individually, or are we marking them as a kind of a composition of those competencies?
Maybe.
Maybe. Maybe we better stop talking about what those competencies are. Give us the answer.
If I'm not mistaken, the primary aim of changing from vertical to horizontal is to minimize the possibility of bias.
Mhm.
That's the main aim.
Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry.
Yeah.
That's right, that helps me. In that case, what you've seen is when you go to horizontal with 2 raters on questions, on similar questions, so they sensitize to those, what you see is a decrease in the carryover effect, correct? So there's a decrease in that particular bias, because that's when you're most interested.
That's right.
And then presumably when you go to 1, that should decrease even more. Or that would be the prediction possibly.
Like when you mean go to one, like when you
Not
go
that,
to
so
one
go to
bias.
1 rater per question.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
1
Yes.
rater per question, so that rater isn't able to give an overall impression score because they just haven't developed one.
Right.
But what they can do is be very sensitized to that question. So almost in a psychometric sense, you've got somebody who really can be more representative of that question. Now, the other thing that is of interest to me, as you noted, with respect to your rater pool, and some of the raters saying that they're not as confident as to who might be a good candidate
Mhm.
because of their level of experience or expertise. One of the things that might be interesting is that when you my understanding of the difference between an expert and a novice primarily is the type of mistakes they make,
Mhm.
right? Because they both make mistakes, it's just
Absolutely.
they make different mistakes.
Yeah.
So you may actually end up with a better rating because with a varied experience pool, because they make different mistakes in their rating. So, and this also just relates to something that I tend to think about the term bias. I tend to think about it as a fancy description of a mistake you don't know you're making.
Yes.
Right? So if you have a broader range of mistakes, then you kind of smooth out all these problems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there's other suggestions, like, should we go, because right now the applicant has the video on, so we can see, like, do they have a pen and paper, are they writing it? But
Yeah.
there's been other suggestions, like, should we be having just a verbal response with no video, so you can't really see what the applicant looks like? Should, like, there's,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Well, that's the orchestral interview where they put them behind the screen. So all you can, what you're looking at is the requisite skill.
exactly.
I think there's been some suggestion that a lot of orchestras are moving away from that for varying reasons. But the concept being that you want to remove as many of the superficial characteristics as you can to look at the predictive skill outcome.
That's right.
And now the graduation rates are probably high no matter what you do. Is that fair?
Yeah, so our graduation rate, so out of 67 learners, we had 66 graduate.
Yeah.
And that's been historical.
consistent across time. So
Yeah. We
that
had some delay and come back a year, but
Yeah.
we still graduated.
the nice thing that suggests is that everything you've done so far has predicted good outcomes for your candidates. You're just trying to tweak a particular thing.
Yes, yes. I mean, the outcomes is a whole other project,
Yep.
and we can work on
Yep.
what that might look like. I think, yes, that's not wrong. I think the other thing we're trying to do is we recognize as a whole, the profession is not very diverse. And we want to make sure that we're not contributing to that lack of diversity. There's other things, so we've implemented facilitated admission streams in hopes of attracting and encouraging individuals who maybe haven't historically seen themselves in the physiotherapy profession coming in. But yes, that is one strategy that we're on. Yeah.
There's just one question in the chat.
I won't touch the board. Want to answer that?
No, they do not have access to any interviewee material. But new this year, we have a facilitated Black admissions program, and applicants to that stream do have the opportunity to submit a 200-word reflection. So in that subset of candidates, there is an opportunity for the interviewer to be reviewing some additional context beyond just the verbal responses.
But the applications file is different. Like in some programs, application files are like letters of reference or a candidate statement outside. So we don't ask for any of that. We ask for their transcripts, and if they meet the B+ on their transcript as their sub GPA and in the minimum for pre-rep courses, that's all they have to give to us. So we're not looking for volunteer. We're not looking for a candidate statement. We're not looking for, which is actually quite different than some of the other programs who are looking for how much time have you volunteered before you come in. So, I mean, those were some of the other steps that we tried to take to try to look at who could potentially feel comfortable applying to the pool and not saying, well, if you didn't volunteer, then you don't have a chance of having a chance to come into the program. So we're a bit unique and across Canada in terms of just having that minimum sub GPA.
It sounds as if all of the steps you're taking are very geared towards the actual requisite core competencies, such that the rest of the stuff is not, it's almost like extra flair and frill. You've removed it because you're looking for the person who's actually predictably going to be an ideal candidate at the other end, as opposed to what did you do to impress me before you showed up?
But we'll find out. Yeah.
But a good point, though.
Yeah.
Okay, here comes the hook.
No, this is the 36, so thank you very much for really this awesome presentation. And please also keep the conversation going to those in the Zoom. If you have other questions, do reach out to them. But thank you very much again for a wonderful education round.
Thank you for having me.